What is up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's the Shield Brother here once again for the History Armada, back with part 2 of the history of the Germanic States. We're going to pick up right where we left off last Thursday, and we're going to continue on through this trek that we're taking with the history of the Germanic States, and where they came from, and where they ended up. So with that, buckle up, and let's get started for today. So, we're starting in the Middle Ages, right where we left off last episode. We're going to pick up on Christmas Day, 800 AD. Charlemagne is crowned emperor by the Roman Pope Leo III, meaning that he is sponsored and protected by the Pope. So it's not like he's just like, oh, I'm emperor. No, the Pope made him emperor. But then, upon his death, like I said last episode, fighting among Charlemagne's grandchildren caused the Carolinian Empire to partition into 3 parts in 843, which you can see in that map on your left there. And the German region developed out of the East Frankish Kingdom, East Francia. From 919 to 936, the Germanic people, Franks, Saxons, Swabians, and Bavarians, were united under Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, who took the title of King of Saxony. The imperial strongholds, called Kaiserflostens, probably butchered that, I'm sorry, became economic and cultural centers, it's what made Aachen famous. It was the most famous. And, these imperial strongholds in these centers became very important for the development of the kingdom and its future endeavors. And on the right, you can see the Holy Roman Empire, because in the Middle Ages, that's what becomes of the former Colonial Empire, which we're about to talk about. So that brings us to Otto the Great. So, in 936 AD, Otto I, or Otto the Great as he became known, was crowned as king at Aachen, as I said, which was very important center of cultural and imperial power. His coronation as emperor by Pope John XII at Rome, in Rome itself, in 962, inaugurated what became later known as the Holy Roman Empire. 962, he becomes emperor, and it's the very basis, it's the birth of the HRE. It's the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't really Roman or that much of an empire, but that's not the point. Otto strengthened the royal authority by reasserting the old Carolingian rights over different appointments and different powers. Otto wrested from the nobles the powers of appointment of the bishops and abbots, who controlled large land holdings themselves. Additionally, Otto received the old Carolingian program of appointing missionaries on the borderlands and choosing where they would go in the borderlands. Otto continued to support celibacy for the higher clergy, so that appointments never became hereditary, and that, a bishop couldn't have a son and be like, yep, my son is now the next bishop. He made sure that he tried to make sure that these higher appointed, they remained celibate. And by granting land to the abbots and bishops he appointed, Otto actually made these bishops into princes of the empires, which you can see could start becoming a problem. It's where all these tiny different dukedoms and princedoms and bishoprics come from, and why there were so many different bodies within this Holy Roman Empire. And in this way, Otto was able to establish a national church by giving them land and solidifying their unity, but also their hierarchy. And outside threats to the kingdom were contained with the decisive defeat of the Hungarian Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 under Otto's rule. The Slavs between the Elbe and the Oder rivers were also subjugated under Otto. And Otto marched on Rome and drove John XII, who had appointed him emperor, drove him from the papal throne, and for years Otto controlled the election of the Pope and the bishops, setting a firm precedent for imperial control of the papacy for years to come in the Holy Roman Empire, and what kind of relationship they would have. During the reign of Conrad II, the son Henry III, the empire supported the Clunic reforms of the church, the peace of God, prohibition of simony, and the required celibacy of priests. These were all supported by Henry III as his rule of emperor. Imperial authority over the Pope reached its peak in the investiture controversy, which began with Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. And it was over appointments to the different offices, and the emperor was compelled to submit to the pope at Canossa in 1077, after having been excommunicated. That kind of, points you in the other direction. So, in 1122, a temporary reconciliation was reached between Henry V and the Pope, and it was called the Concordat of Worms. The consequences of this investiture disputed were a weakening of the Ottonian Church, and a strengthening of the imperial secular princes and their princedoms. So, to cover, there was a rift, and then they kind of reconciliated, but it weakened the church, the national church that Otto I had set up, and it strengthened the individual princedoms. The time between 1096 and 1291 of the Middle Ages under Otto and under the others was the age of the Crusader kings. Knightly religious orders were established, including the Knights Templar, Knights of St. John, and the Teutonic Order. And these were used in different ways. And the Holy Roman Empire was first used under the phrase Holy Roman Empire was first used under Frederick I, documented in 1157, him saying this. And that brings us to the trade point and the Northern Empire, which was the Hanseatic League. This was a long-distance trade in the Baltic intensified, and it was major trading towns became drawn together in this Hanseatic League. Under the leadership of Lübeck, the Hanseatic League was a business alliance of trading cities and their long-distance goals, and their guilds that dominated trade along the coast of Northern Europe. Each of the Hanseatic cities had its own legal system and degree of political autonomy and circle of influence within the Holy Roman Empire and the Germanic peoples. The chief cities were Cologne on the Rhine River, Hamburg, and Bremen of the North Sea, and Lübeck on the Baltic. The League flourished from about 1200 to 1500 in the Middle Ages, and it continued after the 1500s, but with much lesser importance after that. And that brings us to the eastward expansion, and the German outward expansion into these new territories. The German colonization and the chartering of new towns and villages began into largely Slav-inhabited territories east of the Elbe, and such as Bohemia, Silesia, Pomerania, and Livonia. Beginning in 1226, the Teutonic Knights began their conquest of Prussia. You're going to recognize that name, and that name is going to be very important later on in the history of the Germanic States. The native Baltic Prussians were conquered and Christianized by the Knights with much warfare. Like, lots of northern crusades were forced upon these people. Lots of northern crusades were required to bring the Prussian, the Baltic, and the Pomerania under the rule of the Teutonics, as well as the Sword Brothers. And numerous German towns were established along the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea in order to kind of Germanize and colonize these areas. You can see on this map how they expanded outward, and you can see their different towns that they lay along the rivers. And that's how the HRE kind of gets into this eastern area and northern area, and that will be important later as well. So that brings us back to the church and state. So Henry V, the great-grandson of Conrad II, who I mentioned earlier, became Holy Roman Emperor in 1106, in the midst of a civil war. Hoping to gain complete control over the church inside the empire, Henry V appointed Adalbert of Saarbrücken as the powerful Archbishop of Mainz in 1111. Adalbert began to assert the power of the church against secular authorities, that is, the emperor. This precipitated into the crisis of 1111, as it became known. So, part of the long-term controversy of the investiture. In 1137, the magnates turned back to the Hohenstaufen family for a candidate, Conrad III. So, Conrad III tried to divest Henry the Proud of his two duchies, Bavaria and Saxony. He tried to kind of diverge those from him and get them back. This led to a long war in southern Germany as the empire divided essentially into two factions. The first faction called themselves the Welfs, or Guelfs, after Henry the Proud's family. It was his family name, which was the ruling dynasty of Bavaria at the time. The other faction was known as the Waiblings. In this early period, the Welfs generally represented the independence of the church and the papacy. The papacy plus particularism, a strengthening of the local duchies against the central imperial authority, is what drove this faction. The Wablings, on the other hand, stood for the control of the church by a strong central imperial government and a strong emperor to guide it. And that led to a very long civil war caused by the church and state and how they wanted different directions for the Holy Roman Empire. And that brings us to Frederick Barbarossa, who you might recognize his name, and Frederick Barbarossa was Holy Roman Emperor from 1155 to 1190. Between 1152 and 1190, during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa of the Hohenstaufen dynasty yet again, an accommodation was reached with the rival Guelph party by the grant of the Duchy of Bavaria to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony. See, you can see how the Bavarians, Saxons, and the other big ones are always driving the Holy Roman Empire. They're always the one causing problems and also fixing problems. So, Austria became a separate duchy by virtue in 1156 due to this. Barbarossa tried to reassert his control over Italy because the Holy Roman Empire was slowly losing its grasp on northern Italy as well, all of Italy. And in 1177, a final reconciliation was reached between the emperor and the pope in Venice. In 1180, Henry the Lion was outlawed. Saxony was divided, and Bavaria was given to Otto of Wittelsbach. Otto founded the Wittelsbach dynasty, which was to rule Bavaria up until 1918. So, due to this partition of Saxony, Bavaria and this new Wittelsbach dynasty would rule all the way until the end of the First World War. And so, from 1184 to 1186, the Hohenstaufen Empire under Frederick I Barbarossa reached its peak in the Reichsfest, imperial celebrations held at Mainz, and the marriage of his son Henry in Milan to the Norman princess Constance of Sicily. The powers of the feudal lords was undermined by the appointment of ministerials, unfree servants and of the emperor as officials. Chivalry and the court life flowered, it prospered, leading to a development of German culture and literature. So let's talk about the church influences and the Holy Roman Empire. So between 1212 and 1250, Frederick II established a modern professionally administered state from his base in Sicily. He resumed the conquest of Italy, leading to further conflict with the papacy. In the empire, extensive sovereign powers were granted to secular princes and church-appointed officials, leading to the rise of independent territorial states yet again. The duchies and the princedoms and the principalities and the bishoprics and just all these different individual powers that would ride due to all the power plays used in the Holy Roman Empire. The struggle with the Pope sapped the empire's strength, as Frederick II was excommunicated 3 times. After his death, the Hohenstaufen dynasty fell. So that Hohenstaufen dynasty that had lasted for so long, it was over. Followed by Interregnum, during which there was no emperor. There was just a dark period, no emperor. The failure of negotiations between Emperor Louis IV and the papacy in 1338 led to the declaration of Rennes by 6 electors to the effect that the election by all or the majority of the electors automatically conferred the royal title and rule of the emperor without papal confirmation. So this new declaration decided that there would be 6 electors and that there would be no need for the papal power to confirm the electorate of who would be the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He would just be elected and he would be emperor. They don't care what the Pope says. So as a result, the monarch was no longer subject to papal approbation and became increasingly dependent on the favor of the electors. Between 1346 and 1378, Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, sought to restore the imperial authority. The Golden Bull of 1356 stipulated that in the future the emperor was to be chosen by 4 secular electors and 3 spiritual electors. The secular electors were the King of Bohemia, the Count of Palatine on the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. The 3 spiritual electors were the Archbishops of Maine, Trier, and Cologne. So you can see how, again, it's basically the same powers controlling the empire again. And you can just see how the bigger powers such as Bohemia and Saxony are throughout history going to be pooling the empire in different ways. Around the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death ravaged Germany and Europe from the dance of, and around 1350, Germany and almost the whole of Europe was ravaged by the Black Death. Jews were persecuted on religious and economic grounds due to this, and many fled to Poland. The Black Death was the Jews were used as a scapegoat during the Black Death, as well as the Pope pointing to this as a sign of their lack of faith in the Pope and the Church. And the Black Death killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century. And you can see how this disaster was kind of used in different ways as scapegoats and power plays. After the disasters of the 14th century, the war, the plague, and the schism, early modern European society gradually came into being as a result of economic, religious, and political changes. A money economy arose which provoked social discontent among knights and peasants alike. Gradually, a proto-capitalistic system evolved out of feudalism. The Fugger family gained prominence through commercial and financial activities and became financiers to both church and secular rulers. The knightly classes established their monopoly on arms and military skill. However, it was undermined by the introduction of mercenary armies and foot soldiers, which was a complete reform to the military system and economic system. Predatory activity by robber knights and robber barons became common. From 1438, the Habsburgs, that's going to be an important name, the Habsburgs, who controlled most of the southeast of the empire, more or less modern-day Austria and Slovenia, and Bohemia and Moravia, after the death of King Louis II in 1526, maintained a constant grip on the position of the Holy Roman Emperor until 1806, with the exception of the years 1742 to 1745. The situation, however, gave rise to the increased disunity among the Holy Roman Empire's territorial rulers, and it prevented the sections of the country from coming together to form nations in the manner of France and England, where, the three powers and the UK relatively came together to form one power. That was not the case for the Holy Roman Empire. Due to the Habsburgs controlling what would be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the other stronger secular rulers all wanting what's best for themselves, there was never a sense of unity in the Holy Roman Empire whatsoever. And during his reign from 1493 to 1519, Maximilian I tried to reform the empire. He tried to reform the empire, and an imperial supreme court was established under him. Imperial taxes were levied, and the power of the imperial diet, the Reichstag, was increased. The reforms, however, were frustrated by the continued territorial fragmentation of the emperor, and yet again, the secular powers disrupting what would be a reform for the whole of the empire. So, that brings us to women, science, and culture under the new Holy Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, and the Germanic States. So, from the early medieval period and continue through the 18th century, Germanic law assigned women to be a subordinate and dependent position relative to men. However, Frankish law, from which the laws of the German lands would be passed, placed women at a disadvantage already. So, that's where this kind of comes from. And it was with regard to more of a property and inheritance rights. Germanic widows required a male guardian to represent them in court. Unlike Anglo-Saxon law or the Visigothic Code, this Frankish law barred women from royal succession, unlike the other powers west of them. So, social status was based on military and biological roles. A reality demonstrated in rituals associated with newborns when female infants were given a lesser value than male infants. The use of physical force against wives was condoned until the 18th century in Bavarian law. So some women of means asserted their influence during the Middle Ages, however, typically in royal court or convent settings. So Hildegard of Bingen, Gertrude the Great, and Elizabeth of Bavaria, and Argula von Grumbach all are among the women who pursued independent accomplishments in fields as diverse as medicine, music, composition, religious writing, and government and military politics. These 4 or 5 great women kind of stuck their foot in the door and were like, yeah, no, we don't care if we're women. we can do just as good as the men can. And that was very revolutionary, especially with the Bavarian laws and the Germanic laws, especially during the Middle Ages. So, Benedictine Abbess Hilde wrote several influential theological and medicinal texts. And about 100 years later, Walter von der Wack became the most celebrated of the Middle High German lyric poets, which you can see top left, those two. And then around 1439, Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz used movable type printing and issued the Gutenberg Bible. He is seen top right, I believe. Around the transition from the 15th to the 16th century, Albrecht from Nuremberg established his reputation across Europe as painter, printmaker, mathematician, and engraver. So that's when these reputation and the important figures of the Northern Renaissance started to happen. The Northern Renaissance was the Renaissance within the Germanic States, and there was more focused on painting and printing. And these men on your left here, those are from the Northern Renaissance, and that really influenced the science and the culture of the Holy Roman Empire and its Germanic states. So then, in addition, the emperor gained a new title. It was Nationalis Germanicae, which was of the German nation. So he was the emperor of the German nation. To the emperor's title appeared first in the 15th century. That was the first time it was added there. In a 1486 law decreed by Frederick III, which you can see on your right there. And in 1512, in reference to the imperial diet of Cologne by Maximilian I. Actually, I believe that's Maximilian I, my bad. So, by then, the emperors had lost their influence in Italy and Burgundy, so they added of the German nation to their title to kind of differentiate, say, yeah, I'm emperor of the Germans, because they had lost control of Burgundy and Italy, so they no longer wanted to even be associated with that. In 1525, the Hilbron Reform Plan, the most advanced document of German Peasants' War, referred to Reich as von Toscher Nation, of the German nation. So you can see again how that was kind of added to the culture, and that was a new title for the emperor. And that kind of is where we're going to end for today, because that is going to lead into the early modern era. And that's where next week's episode will begin, with the early modern era of the Holy Roman Empire and the other Germanic states, and where they'll start to kind of diverge and where they'll evolve from within this early modern era. But real quick, if you look at this map, you can see the zones of influence of the big parts of the empire. Like I was stating, there's always the big players that kind of drove the little ones. You can see Brandenburg, Austria, Saxony, Bohemia. You can just see the different colors. You can pause here if you want. You can see the different colors and the different zones of influence within the Holy Roman Empire. But catch next week's episode to see the early modern era, and we'll also have a brief talk about the Swiss and Switzerland and its relation to the Holy Roman Empire. So with that, thank you for tuning in. This has been the Shield Brother with another episode of the history of the Germanic states. This has been the History Armada. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll catch y'all next time.